Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. I'll go to full screen mode. Sorry, I have to move it. Shoot. Oh, that's silly. The Zoom thing is in the way of it, but I'll just, there you go. How about now? Is this full screen mode visible to you guys?
Yep, it looks good.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming today, for logging on. It's truly a pleasure to be here, and I first want to thank Natalie so much, and Jesse as well, for reaching out to me months ago. Forgive me for my lack of communication. At times it's been a kind of a crazy time in general, but I nonetheless really appreciate being here virtually at GBO. It's sort of a fun time. As Natalie mentioned, I'm very lucky to say I'll be starting up an assistant professorship at WVU. So it'll be nice to be much closer to GBO. It's been quite a long time since I've been. I remember going for training something like 7-8 years ago. And it coincided with the summer barbecues that you guys tend to have. I remember very well, we played tug of war. I stubbed my toe pretty brutally. It took months to recover from, but it was a really fun time. And it's a really awesome community. So I'm looking forward to being much closer in general. So for my talk today, I wanted to chat with you all about some developments in terms of activity going on within the Canadian radio astronomical community with regards to enabling a telescope as shown here called CHIME that I'll describe, enabling it to perform radio-transient science measurements alongside its nominal and very important measurements for low redshift cosmology, and the impact it's having on the field of fast radio bursts in particular. So I figured I would start with describing what fast radio bursts are for those who are not as familiar with the field. FRBs, or fast radio bursts, the name's a bit on the nose. They're literally just millisecond duration bursts at radio frequencies. They're quite energetic, and for reasons I'll describe in the next slide or two, we can infer that FRBs emanate from cosmological origins. They occur outside of our galaxy. And again, given those basic properties of the distance, the brightness, and so on, lots of ideas have been put forth about what these things are. And yet there's no real consensus about what these things could be due to, what the populations are, and so on. And so that's all great. And it's been a huge motivator, as the field really only started in 2007 when Duncan Warmer over at WVU found the first FRB with a student at the time, David Narkovic. But between then, 2007 and mid-2018, only 70 of FRBs were found using single-dish telescopes around the world, and the Green Bank telescope being one of the earliest key instruments for the field, because it found one quite bright, one with really interesting polarimetric information, and was shown to actually yield lots of information besides just a single simple burst. But despite there being projected thousands occurring per day across the sky, single-dish telescopes are quite limited, and they're not able to see a lot of them at over a short instant in time, again, just due to their very narrow fields of view. So there's been lots of motivation to try to enable fast radio burst astronomy to be in this sort of high data point era, large data set era, where we can start to infer things about the astrophysics and the phenomena behind these things. So despite lots of open questions within FRB astronomy, there are a few things that we do know. Like I said, FRBs are extragalactic. And the reason why we know this is because impulsive radiation that traverses the interstellar medium undergoes this effect called dispersion. And this is due to the fact that, according to Maxwell's equations, when the radio signal traverses the cold, tenuous plasma of the ISM, that circumstance introduces a frequency dependence in the index of refraction of the medium, which means that at different frequencies, the group velocity of the packet will be smeared out, such that we ultimately see a time delay, with the signal being observed at different frequencies, as shown here from Duncan Warmer's paper. And this dispersion measure, the degree to which you see this delay, or observe the delay, is a column density parameter. So it's an indirect function of distance. And with available models of the galactic electronic content, we are able to infer that FRBs tend to have dispersion measures, or DMs, that greatly exceed those values we'd expect for the galaxy, for values we observe with pulsars, for example. And because of that, in order to reconcile those differences, they must be originating from far, far outside of the galaxy. Hence, they are extragalactic. Like I said, FRBs are mysterious, just given the basic properties of being how brilliant they are and how far away they are and how long they last for, again, on the order of milliseconds, those basic properties have given rise to a very vast landscape of ideas in terms of what could be causing these things to happen. The landscape goes from sort of stellar scales, say with accretion physics, or things associated with relativistic shocks around highly magnetized environments, or more microphysical things like superradiance, for example, or cataclysmic events like supernovae or some form of events that occur associated with collapse of stars, or on much grander scales like maybe some funny interactions with supermassive black hole binary systems, or even more exotic phenomena like cosmic strings. And there's so many theories out there. I encourage folks who are interested to find the review written by Emma Plotz, a living and evolving review of the current theories that exist, ones that are viable, ones that have been recently ruled out. This list is comprehensive and is, again, being actively updated as more ideas come forward. But like I said, one of the key things is that FRBs really are everywhere. Based on the projections you can estimate from a single dish pointing at a certain part of the sky for some amount of time, finding, say, one burst. When you extrapolate that for the whole sky, lots of different surveys, lots of different instruments are consistent in the predictions that there should be hundreds, if not thousands, of these things occurring per sky per day is the normal unit in FRB astronomy. But again, with the single dish telescope, it's really tricky to find lots of these just because, again, you're so sensitive to a single point. In that sense, it's really important to develop instruments that could, leverage sky coverage and sensitivity, which is what I'll talk about and hopefully demonstrate that CHIME does that. But beyond the mystery and the intrigue, or the intrigue associated with the mystery, recently it's been shown that FRBs are useful as probes for all sorts of different problems as well. A key example of which is the discovery and analysis of the first repeating FRB. And we say that FRBs are repeating when the source at a specific point in the sky emits a burst with the same dispersion measure multiple times, more than once, say. It doesn't have to be periodic, but nonetheless, we can infer from bursts occurring at the same time, at the same position on the sky and the same dispersion measure, that it must be associated with the same source. Then, therefore, the source is repeating. And it was shown with follow-up using the Very Large Array in Socorro, New Mexico, that with these sorts of repeating FRBs, they naturally allow for follow-up that allows you to localize the position of a subsequent burst so well that you can then actually associate the position of the source, the FRB source, with the host galaxy, say. And then you can actually employ multi-wavelength analyses, as was done for this repeating FRB 121102, where you study the spectroscopic properties of the host galaxy, you measure spectral lines, you obtain a redshift through that analysis. And then you can actually start to make interesting inferences about the energetics of the system, or even, as was shown quite recently, ways in which you can use that information to infer cosmological information. Most recently, last year, the late J.P. McCart and his collaborators down in Australia used the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder called ASCAP to localize at least 6 FRBs, as shown on the right, to their host galaxies. They followed up each host galaxy with a 10-meter class instrument. They obtained redshifts for these things. And with their data set, along with archival measurements of FRBs and their host galaxy properties, they were able to show that indeed, based on the dispersion measures you measure in the radio and the redshifts you measure in the optical of the host galaxy, you can actually find a correlation in these parameters that are consistent with predictions from lambda CDM models of the universe. Therefore, you can use these measurements to actually, and in their study, they even infer a baryonic mass fraction from FRB measurements. So they nicely demonstrated that you could actually use FRBs as probes for cosmology, as an example. And these sorts of things are what burgeon the field onwards towards solving mysteries and then applying those things to solve other mysteries as well, or answer different questions that are not even within the radio, but very much outside of the radio regime. So with that, I wanted to discuss the CHIME telescope. So for those who aren't as familiar, CHIME stands for the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment. It is as shown. Oh, sure, go ahead.
Just please. A question about the angular resolution. I missed a little bit. How did it seem like the angular resolution of your FRB was pretty fine? If you go back, yeah. I mean, so what is the actual angular resolution you're getting, and how are you getting it?
Well, so Shami Chatterjee and company used the VLA. I can't remember which
So these
observer
are
specifically.
okay.
But yeah, with that, so they specifically needed a long baseline interferometer to get down to sub-arc second precision in their localization.
So these
But
are really very quick follow-up observations, and obviously that you happen to see. Okay, good. Thank
yeah, so it's an interesting point though, because FRBs, it's hard to predict anything with FRBs. So I'm not exactly sure how much time they use the VLA for, but my understanding is that they needed to wait quite a long time before they were able to catch amount of data that contained a burst that they then used to localize the source and so on. So there was a bit of a waiting game.
Sorry, Emmanuel. So with the VLA, that was actually during a test session for the actual observation. They have an FRB detector on it, and that's how they were able to detect that with the VLA. So we were doing quite a bit of follow-up with Arecibo, but as for the VLA itself, that was actually done during one of the first test sessions to see if the configuration would work. So
okay, thanks, Andrew.
You'll remember, Andrew, we actually measured a very accurate position using the HSA as well.
yeah, in the EVN, and so
HSA,
yeah, and so that was after that initial localization with that one. So,
that's right.
Sorry about that.
No. Thank you, Andrew. And hi, Chris. Nice to see you again. It's been a while. So again, that's a very brief crash course introduction about FRB astronomy in general. It's a very young field, quite chaotic field, largely initially for a long time, given the few measurements that were available, but nonetheless ones that were made by by really great teams. Andrew being a part of the team that studies 121102. But I now wanted to talk about the CHIME telescope because, as I mentioned before, the CHIME telescope is primarily, or at least originally, an instrument for cosmology. It's generating sky maps in the purpose of detecting baryon acoustic oscillations between the 400 megahertz frequency range, which corresponds to a small range in redshifts. But shortly after construction, shortly after construction of CHIME began, it was realized that, given the specifications of the CHIME instrument and the correlator that I think Nolan Denman's in this call and was a huge part of the correlator, those specifications were conducive for performing radio-transient science measurements with CHIME. And with that, a lot of development began to take place after construction for CHIME began in earnest to develop a backend that would be attached to the CHIME correlator so that it would, among other things, perform a real-time search of fast radio bursts, largely because of the fact that with CHIME, given its half-cylindrical optics, as you saw in that video, the field of view of CHIME is quite large, again, and that's largely because of the primary science case for generating all-sky maps from the CHIME site at the Dominion Radio Astrophysical Observatory. But with the graphics-enabled correlator that Nolan and many other people designed and put together, it was shown that there's enough throughput within the system that allows for synthesizing beams of heightened sensitivity that would pad the field of view of CHIME that could be used by what I'll call later the CHIME FRB backend to search in real time for fast radio burst signals. So this is one of the key things about CHIME is that we're able to actually perform searches across a huge chunk of the sky at any instant in time. In fact, I think the rough figure merit here, as shown with this sort of vertical cylindrical strip, is something like 200 square degrees, I think, at any instant in time. And again, that's a nice leverage against single dish telescopes. Obviously, in a lot of ways, they're superior in different ways. But when you're trying to perform something like a wide field time resolved survey, something with this design is actually a key thing, basically. And as with many other instruments before and after, it's a huge labor of love that's been performed over many years by many different people. In fact, I believe that's Nolan here. And it's taken a long, long time just to make the various parts of the system work, all the way from the detection and channelization down to the cross correlation, down to the backends, front end, back end, and so on. So there's been lots of work for a very long time just to make the CHIME telescope come to fruition as it has over the last couple of years. And in the end, for the radio transient science cases, so far we have built at least 2 telescope backends that perform different measurements. And again, the focus of this talk is the CHIME FRB backend, which is shown here on the left. It's this 128 computing cluster that, again, conceptually does a real-time search of up to 1,024 total intensity beams generated by the CHIME correlator that's transmitted to the CHIME FRB backend, and searches that time series for fast radio burst signals. And I'll describe that in the next few slides. It won't talk about it any further besides this note, but on the right is shown a backend that we built for CHIME to detect and follow up radio pulsars. It's a very near and dear to my heart because I effectively serve as the project manager for the system. And hopefully one day you'll invite, or someone will come and give a nice talk about the science that's being done with this instrument. It's a pretty powerful instrument in its own way. Okay, so in terms of what CHIME FRB does as a backend for the CHIME telescope is it's basically performing a fishing expedition. The CHIME correlator, as shown here on the left of this admittedly complex diagram, is generating up to 1,024 Stokes-I, what are called formed beams that are then being transmitted that pad the CHIME field of view. And those data are constantly being transmitted to the CHIME FRB backend, which then performs a series of steps in order to ultimately identify within this time chunk, there was an FRB or several FRBs with these properties. And based on the significance of that detection and the properties of that we can determine in real time, we're going to then make decisions about, do we save this data? Do we alert the community? Do we analyze further? Do we discard it? Is this a real astrophysical signal? Is it RFI, et cetera? So this schematic just shows you the order in which those operations are performed. And underneath the schematic is many tens of thousands of lines of Python and C++ code just to, again, have this search be performed in an automated and homogeneous way. And I think that's one of the key things is that the CHIME correlator, is being as powerful as it is generating so much data, as I'm sure most people are aware of. With any large-scale instrument, you can't record all that data. And in order to perform this kind of robust, homogeneous survey of the sky for FRBs, you really need to make decisions in order to keep data and also discard data too, right? And so this schematic is just meant to encapsulate how thorough the system is designed for those sorts of actions. One of the key things about the CHIME FRB backend, what it does in real time, is that it actually takes the input Stokes-I intensity data and performs real time, what's called incoherent de-dispersion of those time series channelized data. And so as I mentioned at the top, real astrophysical impulsive signals, as they traverse the interstellar medium, get dispersed. So there's this basically time lag across receiver bandwidths here. And on the top right here, what is shown is what the effect when you ignore dispersion and instead just brute force your way towards some sort of significance metric, say a signal to noise ratio. Normally, you would just take all that data cube, compress it, average it, or integrate it across frequency so that you can obtain a high signal to noise, or presumably obtain a high signal to noise profile. And then you would estimate the signal to noise ratio of that time series so that you can then say, oh, hey, there's a signal here or not. But if you ignore dispersion and you don't treat it in any way, you end up getting this smeared out pulse here. And again, that's just due to the fact that there's this time lag across your bandwidth that you're ignoring. What CHIME FRB does, and what a lot of systems do in general when studying pulsars or FRBs, is that they perform some kind of de-dispersion. So they with some assumed value of the dispersion measure, you then chunk up your data set across frequency and you shift data by an amount consistent with the expected effects due to dispersion. And then after the shifting, you then integrate to then at least roughly capture the intrinsic signal. And it's incoherent because you're not perfectly, there's some resolution to which you can actually shift things just based on what how you design your system for shifting subbands and so on. So it's not perfect, but you can still recover things much better than if you were to ignore dispersion altogether. And the CHIME FRB backend does this in real time. And this is the key way in which we are able to identify signals, is by this incoherent optimized de-dispersion algorithm that then returns various metrics of significance that are then used downstream for decision making. So again, that's a very rough description of the CHIME FRB backend itself, but ultimately what the CHIME FRB backend produces is a constant stream of data that tells you, what it's seen at some part of the sky at some instant in time, which is what's shown here as this sort of sky map, time series map of the sky, basically. So on the horizontal axis here is time, or specifically our angle. So as time moves forward, you're going more and more to the right, or rather the sky here is drifting from right to left. And the y-axis, or the vertical axis here, is elevation. I think, as I showed, let me see if I can get back to it quickly. Yeah, so CHIME FRB receives the time series data for these 1024 formed beams that are formed by the CHIME correlator and transmitted to the CHIME FRB backend. And the idea here is that you have some distribution of these formed beams padded at different parts of the sky. And so what this map shows you is it shows you the north-south extent of those beams. And each pixel, each color here corresponds to the signal to noise of the brightest detection made in that column of 4 beams, right? Because there's 1024 beams that are formed in this 256 by 4 sets of columns. And each column here just says, like, if you were to look here, for example, this pixel has a value corresponding to the signal to noise of some signal detected by the system in that row of 4 beams. And as you then look at different parts of the sky at different times, you see all these streaks where the brighter pixels correspond to signals of much higher significance or signal to noise. The darker, more purple colors are those where there's low significance, therefore likely just system noise, right? And for those who are wondering, these horizontal streaks here are the transits of known pulsars in our galaxy, bright pulsars during, I think this corresponds to the passage of the galactic plane, where there are lots of pulsars found by many different surveys, the GBT surveys being among them. And the idea here is that the system, the CHIME FRB system, really is good at detecting lots of signals, whether they're extragalactic or not. It has this huge range of dispersion measures that it searches over. So the system itself is a great monitor of single pulses from galactic sources. But the reason why I refer to CHIME FRB as a fishing expedition is because in this river of signals and data, the CHIME FRB system not only ingests and produces these metrics, but is actually designed to make decisions about, okay, we see all these signals, all these sources are astrophysically interesting in their own right, but because we want to find FRBs in real time, we need to be able to make decisions based on the detections made by the de-dispersion algorithm, such that we isolate or capture data for the one FRB that I circle here, right? So in that sense, the CHIME FRB system really is, the net with which through the river of data flows through, and only the FRBs are caught by the net, basically. And again, once FRBs are identified, at the very end, decisions are made. Oh, it's an especially bright FRB, so we're going to save not only the total intensity data with which we found the FRB, but because we're able to upstream buffer raw telescope baseband, if it's really bright, then we'll actually record the baseband data that contains that burst to disk as well, right? But if it's not super bright, then we won't save baseband. And again, because this is such a big data kind of experiment, you really need to make decisions about what sorts of things you keep and how you process those things too, because otherwise you'd just be recording an overwhelming amount of data very, very quickly. So this plot is meant to show a day in the life of the CHIME FRB system, basically. It's just constantly digitizing the sky and searching for bursts, and finds lots of bursts all the time. In the end, it hopes to find a single FRB, but it sees a lot of galactic sources too that are known or unknown as well. And I can talk about that if people have questions too. So now just to move on to a brief highlight reel of what CHIME FRB has done so far and how GBO is very much coming into the fold as
Just one more little question. So
yeah, go ahead, please.
Since you have to do the de-dispersion, are you showing like the highest, that you're selecting one de-dispersion here, or all picking the strongest de-dispersion parameter when you plot? How is de-dispersion already folded into this plot or not?
Yes, yeah. So basically, the CHIME FRB system performs what's called a tree de-dispersion. So it's actually taking the data cube and doing a wide range of trial DM values, and then after it runs its trial, it will then say, okay, given this array of dispersion measures, I derive these signal to noise values, and within that series, there's at this DM there's a really bright there's some signal that has a dispersion measure that exceeds our thresholds, right? And those thresholds are tunable as well. in this figure, like you said, unfolding all that information. So so something that is basically averaged over is the specific dispersion measure at any instant of time and within any pixel. It's not isolating a single dispersion measure. There's all possible dispersion measures are basically represented here. But the color scale is just significance basically. And the reason why I singled out this one is that, so for instance, this particular source has a dispersion measure of say 20 sort of parsecs per cubic centimeter. That's the typical dispersion measure unit we quote in literature. But this signal here had something like 800 parsecs per cubic centimeter.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So in that sense, you can't discriminate, but it's a good question for sure. And please do feel free to ask questions whenever you have them too. I appreciate it. So just a really quick rundown of what's been going on. So around mid 2018, we began to pre-commission our system. We turned on the system in a very small scale version of what it is now as a way of testing what we had currently built at the time. And within a few, maybe not as quick as Andrew said for detecting 121102 with the VLA, but within a week or so, we actually were able to find a single FRB just during test observations, trying to get a sense of do our computers light on fire when we let them run for a week or so, or not, et cetera. We actually found an FRB during those tests, and we all got very excited, and we published that result in an astronomer's telegram, which is what's a forum typically used by astronomers or who work in the transient side of astrophysics, alerting the community that we're starting to slowly but surely operate, and we're finding signals too. And the reason why this discovery was interesting was because one of the major questions hanging over CHIME in general is that it's a low frequency experiment. Almost all other FRB projects or experiments at that time were operating at high frequencies or higher frequencies, say L band or higher. And other similar telescopes had actually tried to make measurements down at very low frequencies with LOFAR, the Late Arecibo Observatory with its 430 megahertz receiver, but no detections were being made. So it was speculated that, at low frequencies, at frequencies that CHIME's operating at, it's likely that we'll find very few or none at all. It was an open question. But within a few days, we were able to say, hey, there's stuff down here, and who knows how much we'll see, right? Within a few months, actually within a few weeks since that first detection, the CHIME FRB experiment discovered 13 fast radio bursts within a several week period of time. And again, if you compare that with the 70 found over 10, 11 years, it bode very well, right? Finding such a large number over, say, a few weeks or so was a good indicator that, hey, we may actually be able to, populate the phase space, so to speak, with detections and characteristics and so on. But among those first 13 detections we made, one of them was found to be a similar repeating burst to the one that Andrew and others were a huge part of a few years back. And with that, CHIME FRB quickly found the second repeating fast radio burst known. And it was found to be quite active. I mean, within a month or so, it was emitting bursts pretty frequently, and 5 were shown here. And one of we ourselves were sort of curious. Again, it was a new system at the time, so we were just asking ourselves questions about our system. Was it really a real signal? Were we somehow biasing ourselves in some way? We just weren't expecting, we weren't expecting to be as productive as we were right out of the gate. But one of the many things that really convinced us we were starting to see real things was the fact that when you compare the burst one of the repeater bursts that CHIME saw with ones that Andrew and others studied for 121102, a totally different source, a different part of the sky, different dispersion measure, et cetera, characteristics were actually pretty comparable. And one of the kind of key, albeit mysterious, features of repeating fast radio bursts is the fact that they have this really wonky spectral temporal properties. Not all the time, but often enough, where you see this, you see these multiple components of disparate bursts, and they have this funny, downward drifting structure where you see the first burst occurs at a higher frequency, the middle or second burst occurs at a slightly lower frequency, and then you just sort of trail to lower frequencies over time. And sure enough, with one of the first 5 bursts detected of the second repeating source with CHIME, we saw a similar structure there too. And again, things like this are not actually yet explained. They're very much a defining feature of repeater bursts, but they're not understood. But we were able to say, wow, this one source, 121102, may not actually be that unique at all, which is yet another open question in the field, given how young FRB astronomy is. But we were starting to piece together that there may be a population of these sorts of things. They behave similarly, and they may be all over the place, although time will tell. And we were actually producing real interesting astrophysical measurements seen elsewhere, which was a nice verification of the system. So ever since mid-2018, we've been operating basically as long as the CHIME correlator is operational, acquiring data, ingesting data, searching for FRBs, finding them, characterizing them, and so on. And within a single year of operation, from basically mid-2018 to mid-2019, we went from knowing of one repeating FRB source that Andrew and others were a part of to an additional 18 found by CHIME. And so in that sense, we were starting to really run away with the notion that, hey, we're starting to actually build these statistics with this wide field sensitive interferometer. And again, that's great for all sorts of reasons, whether you're someone who likes to perform phenomenological studies or search for correlations and things. It helps to have a large data set of many different sources that, while being different in all sorts of ways, behave similarly enough, right? And so, over that first year, we published several studies just presenting these repeating FRB sources, which have been followed up by many different people in the community. And I'll show an example of the GBT being used very beautifully for this. And like I said, with this growing data set, we started to tease out initial hints of potential significant differences in certain characteristics that point to different populations of FRB sources. And I'll show an example of that in the next slide. One of the nice things is that we have active ongoing partnerships with various groups around the world, but especially within the NRAO GBO community. We work quite closely with various folks in RealFast and the VLight systems, so that we can work together to follow up our sources and actually hope to study these things further, whether it's finding more bursts or actually localizing them with long baseline interferometers. And it's likely to be an even more fruitful partnership, because we have 18 we had 18 sources within that first year. We have now at least 70, so it's a growing list for sure. Like I said, as I mentioned before, with this growing data set, we're starting to tease out statistically significant differences in the way different types of FRBs behave. And what this figure shows here is what happens when you take bursts that are observed to be from the same repeating sources, which are shown in these light orange histograms here, and then you separate out FRBs that are what we call apparent one-off repeaters. They apparently do not repeat. At that part of the sky, at that dispersion measure, we saw one burst and that was it, right? If you take those two different populations and then derive basic characteristics, say the temporal widths of the burst, the spectral occupancy of the burst, and so on, there's actually distinct differences in the way these bursts can be characterized. And these plots specifically show differences in pulse widths, for example, right? And the key thing here is that for repeating FRBs, whatever the mechanisms are that generate these things, the mechanisms nonetheless produce much temporally wider bursts, whereas bursts that are observed that have not repeated at all are instead very, very narrow. And I believe Andrew and others have actually studied, looked at different sources and found that, you can get a wide range of these sorts of characteristics of temporal width, spectral widths, etc. And these differences are being resolved as the data set grows more and more. So all that points to is that with something like a CHIME telescope, along with many other instruments, we're starting to now delineate, albeit indirectly, hints at there being a population of progenitor systems or different types of astrophysical environments that could be producing FRBs in general. Is there a question? Sorry, I thought I heard someone on mute for a second. Okay. Again, feel free to interrupt me. I appreciate that. But as I'll mention very briefly too, like I said, the CHIME FRB backend in real time performs a search in Stokes I, or total intensity. But as I mentioned before, given the autonomous nature of the system and the way in which we've programmed it, it makes decisions in real time. And for especially bright bursts, part of the decision making is, hey, if it's really bright, let's record telescope baseband that contains, again, complex voltages that preserves phase information. that allows you to derive the full Stokes vector for that data set, therefore enabling polarization studies of our sources too. And just a quick advertisement, we actually do, for these especially bright bursts, we are able to perform polarimetric information, derive polarimetric information as well, that allows us to derive things like polarization position angles, polarization profiles that are avenues for exploring magneto-ionic effects that could be affecting the FRB signals. And this was actually shown for the first FRB that the GBT found. It was shown that you can actually derive things like a rotation measure and polarization position information from that GBT burst. And it was also done with the FRB 1102 as well. But with CHIME, for specific circumstances, we could record this information for bright bursts and derive that information too. And therefore grow the population of not just dispersion measures, but rotation measures as well that encode magnetic information that impinge on the signal as it traverses the media. About a year ago, we put out a study showing that there's a specific repeating FRB that we currently know of that is not only repeating, the source emits multiple bursts, but the source is behaving in such a way where it's active in a periodic fashion. So what's shown here on the top, at least, is a figure of the x-axis is time. So you see 2018, mid-late 2018, all the way till about a year ago. And these upside down red triangles denote times at which we made a detection with the FRB system of this repeating source R3. And the point I'm trying to make is that once we started to acquire a large number of detections of this source, we were actually able to tease out that it turns out that the times at which we saw a burst were actually periodic, with some periodicity of about 16 days or so, which is the first kind of its discovery. It was actually recently done for 121102 as well. Several groups noting that there's a very long period on the order, I think 150 days. Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong. But the idea here is that it was the first time we were actually able to establish some sort of coherent behavior in what were otherwise completely chaotic sources, such as repeating FRB sources. And with that, there's been an influx of ideas in terms of what could be producing this periodicity and this repeating FRB and its activity, rather. And the long story short is that there's no clear picture, but people have been putting forth ideas of binary interaction, which naturally give rise to periodicities, especially ones on the order of many days or even hours. But nonetheless, these sorts of measurements are starting to unveil what sorts of environments the sources could be living in, that then with a sense of what those sources could be residing in, then allow you to say, well, okay, if it's a binary system and it's, say it's a highly magnetic pulsar orbiting an OB star, for example, which have been seen in our galaxy, maybe there's an interaction of materials such that it produces these ultra brilliant flashes we just haven't seen in our own galaxy yet, right? So these sorts of measurements help in trying to tease out a sense of what could be going on in those immediate environments. But again, CHIME itself is not, it might be great for the numbers game, which is important for a numbers starred field like FRB astronomy, but it can only do so much. And as one example, we are only sensitive to the 400 to 800 megahertz range. We can't see above or below that by ourselves. So over the last year and a half or so, myself and a few others have been submitting proposals to the GBT to follow up our sources and try to get a sense, to try to make detections at different frequencies, especially lower frequencies, as was done very nicely by Progenitors and company using the GBT, finding lots of bursts, low frequency bursts with the Green Bank telescope. The behaviors were pretty similar to those of CHIME, but nonetheless numerous still. So it really bode well in the sense that even lower frequency surveys may be fruitful. And these measurements were verified with additional detections made at the Sardinia radio telescope over in Italy. Even very recently, Emily Parent and company used the results from data recorded for the Green Bank North Celestial Cap Survey, or GBNCC, in order to find a low frequency burst from an untargeted searching survey, which is great. And even most recently, as of a month or two ago, Ziggy Plunis and company used LOFAR to detect the same source, R3, but at low frequencies, I think as low as 100 and something, 150 megahertz. So again, it shows that there really are sources across the spectrum. initial worries of there being what's called a spectral turnover, where some electromagnetic process prevents FRB radiation from being generated at those low frequencies. It may be that the turnover is even much lower or just not relevant, and that searching down to low and high frequencies is a worthwhile endeavor. So I have a few minutes, I think, so I'm going to wrap up very quickly. One of the most recent sort of big deal discoveries made by CHIME, as well as an independent observatory called STER2 over on the West Coast, was the discovery of bursts generated by a galactic source called SGR 1935 plus 2154. It's a galactic magnetar being highly magnetized neutron stars. But the detection made with CHIME and STER2 was so bright, it was so intrinsically bright, that if you were to place this galactic magnetar, I think at extragalactic distances, say Andromeda or even farther, the brightness you would observe from that same source would make it look like an FRB. So the energetics basically matched, and it was actually the first decisive hint or evidence even that FRBs could actually be neutron stars, which have been largely suspected for a long time, but until this specific detection, it just really wasn't clear what these things could be due to. It was largely speculated and generally agreed upon that neutron stars likely play a key role, but this really was the first evidence that there is a link between these two classes of neutron stars that we study, know, and love, and FRBs that are kind of just a total black box of a phenomenon, right? So these sorts of detections with all-sky monitors like STER2 or CHIME, are very much filling in even that part of the landscape of looking at galactic sources and making these inferences that tie these phenomena together. So again, just to summarize next steps, a few weeks ago, the CHIME FRB team, we actually finally submitted our catalog of 535 FRBs that were found by CHIME over the past 1 year or so for review at AppJ Supplements. So that's, as far as I know, undergoing review now, and hopefully should be out in the near future, as in the next month or two. And as this number indicates, there's a lot of FRBs. And with this data, there's lots of student-led projects going on at the moment and should be submitted over the next month or two, studying very different aspects of this catalog. Again, the catalog paper itself, the thing we submitted, just provides basic characterization of the bursts, things that we've done in the past in previous studies. But with such a large data set, we can now perform all sorts of interesting different measurements, like a correlation between the current locations we can derive from CHIME FRB data with large-scale structure in the universe. And this is being led by a master's student in Canada. There's also just different analyses, whether you're interested in trying to discern, are there preferred sky locations of FRBs or not? Are there relationships between various parameters, say the dispersion measure and scattering properties, the way in which the media actually causes light rays to scatter and then produces these nice frequency-dependent broadening of the pulses? Are there other sort of types of burst morphologies that could be derived from these data? Long story short, yes. And there are papers being led by all these students looking at different statistical properties of the data set that are coming out within the next month or two, I would say. So please keep an eye out for those great works being led by junior, nonetheless, pivotal members of the CHIME FRB team. But I can't remember who asked, forgive me, but one of the big questions I think CHIME FRB is working towards, and this is where GBO has come in quite nicely, is that there's a growing sense of finding, producing larger numbers of FRB statistics is great, and there's lots you can do with it, as I showed in the previous slides. Nonetheless, if you want to jettison the field beyond the radio and really tie into a multi-wavelength avenue, we really need to be able to say where these FRBs occur on the sky. Because as I showed in the introduction, once you do that, as Andrew and company did for 121102, you can then follow up host galaxies, you can then measure redshifts, you can then enter the cosmological game, so to speak, with FRBs. And in that sense, a recent review by Jim Cordes and Shami Chatterjee very explicitly said the identification of host galaxies of FRBs is the most urgent priority for FRB science because of the things that become available to you once you have those localizations. And so with that, over the past few years, people have been planning ahead for what's called Outriggers for CHIME FRB, companion telescopes, small-scale clones of CHIME, of one of the CHIME half cylinders, located at large baselines on the order of thousands of kilometers. This is a very old graphic, so I think some of these sites are not in play. But recently, from my understanding, the Green Bank Observatory is very much one of the key players in the Outrigger project for Chime. And I believe, again, forgive me if I'm wrong, because I'm not as tied in yet to these things, but I know that Kevin Bandura has been doing lots of work at the GBO site in preparation for this. And I look forward to helping out and interacting with people for this project as well for the years to come. And with the key goal of localizing thousands of FRBs within the next few years. It may seem a bit crazy, but again, as I hopefully have demonstrated, Chime FRB is producing thousands of FRBs over, say, a few years or so, just in terms of detection. So ideally, with these low frequency, long baseline interferometers, we could ideally localize thousands of FRBs too. And there's a growing team of people who are working towards seeing that vision through. And the Green Bank Observatory is very much a key hallmark of that project for sure. So this is just a schematic of what things will look like, what the goals are, thousands of FRBs localized in short order. And with those localizations, you can then go to optical catalogs or follow up with optical telescopes as necessary, and ideally have thousands of redshifts, and then pad out those correlations even more, and maybe even infer cosmological parameters with greater precision that rival those obtained with, say, CMB experiments. And the very, very last thing I promise is with Chime being as prolific as it is, it's not the last, it's certainly not the last word, and is very much in the process of being succeeded by a next generation observatory within Canada called CORE, the Canadian Hydrogen Observatory and Radio-transient Detector, of which I'm working on as a preliminary project scientist for the Pulsar Science case. But the idea here is that it's leveraging multiple sites, the Dominion Radioastrophysical Observatory shown here in the northwest part, GBO located over here. Again, very old graphic, forgive me, because ironically, these two I think are not in play anymore. But the idea here being that with this next generation observatory, we're going to take things even further, localize more, find more, and again, propel FRB astronomy into a multi-wavelength, high numbers era, basically. So with that, I will end, take any and all questions you have. The long story short being that the Chime telescope has really opened the radio transient sky, allowing for all sorts of really awesome follow-up with the Green Bank Observatory, for example, and with CORD on the horizon, as well as the Outrigger project for Chime. There's going to be lots of nice connections, I think, between the two facilities, and I look forward to being part of that. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Emmanuel. We have time for one quick question, if anyone has a quick question.
Yes, I have one, if no one has.
Okay.
Well, how strong do you know the periodicity in that case? I mean, you can predict the next event in the periodicity source, or just a quasi-periodic event like a QPO? Thank you, and nice talk.
No, well, thank you for attending, and it's a great question. Thank you. So the periodicity is established enough such that yes, we can actually predict when this repeating source will be active. And in fact, these observations that myself and Pragya Challa proposed to follow up this same source with the Green Bank telescope about a year ago. And I remember this because I was observing at like 4 a.m. of the source, I think, at the time. We actually predicted that the source would be active based on that periodicity. So we were able, again, I mean, and that's a very nice, so far unique feature of within FRB astronomy, is that there was some predictability in its behavior that we used in our proposal for these data. And then we proved that, yes, it's periodic, and we see it when we expect to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any final questions? All right, we will end here. We will meet back again next week, Thursday the 11th. Our speaker then is Zachary, and we will, I guess, see you all then. Thanks again, Emmanuel.